able to discuss the link between the health, community health, as well as epidemiology. We are going to be discussing about the importance of social determinants of health in epidemiology. We'll be talking about poverty and related to social epidemiology. And we are also going to explain some of the concepts that are being used in epidemiology, namely the exposure variable and the outcome variable, and how these are related. Now, if we talk about epidemiology, I think this is not the first time that you have been able to, you just heard about epidemiology. According to you, what do you think is epidemiology? Is it a study of the epidemics, or what is it exactly? Any candidate who can just tell us what he or she thinks about epidemiology. I think you just heard about it even during the introduction course, right? So anyone who just want to tell us what is epidemiology? Any candidate?
Thank you. I think epidemiology is the study of those determinants and health-related states and events in specified populations.
Thank you so much. Anyone who needs to add something from what your colleague has been mentioning? Is there any addition? Yeah, thank you so much. It actually has epidemiology is from different versions. You can also see that when we talk about epi, we are just talking about something that is happening among some people. And when we are talking about demos, we are talking about district, specified people, and so on. And when we talk about logos, it's always about studying something. So this is about the study, what is upon the people. Do you still see the slides, please? Great. Yeah, as we were just mentioning, epidemiology is not only about epidemics, or it's not only about diseases. So it is about what is upon the people. And as you mentioned, this is the study of the distribution and the determinants of health-related events or even states, but also, most importantly, the applications of this to control health-related problems. So it's not only about learning the distribution of diseases or their determinants, but also the knowledge or the applications of this in terms of the control of those diseases or other kind of health-related problems. Now, as we mentioned, epidemiology is about studying, and this should be in terms of scientific studying, something that is systematic, but also data-driven, which is informed by the data. We also talk about the distribution when we talk about the frequency, when we talk about the patterns. And you mentioned something about the determinants, and here we are talking about causes, but also some kind of risk factors for some diseases in terms of health-related states or events. And this, not only having that kind of particular knowledge, but also how it may be applied in terms of the control of health-related problems. And if we look at the definition, now you can see that epidemiology is everywhere. So it is, you can find epidemiology in terms of different specialties. When we talk about epidemiology, we can refer to the social determinants of health. And here we are also looking at the definition of what is really a social epidemiology, which is the scientific study of the social determinants of health, but also influence of those social characteristics of individuals in the communities at large on the health of individuals, but also how does health of those individuals influence those social characteristics. So when we talk about that it is being related to all these many specialties, here we are talking about medical specialties, we are talking about public health specialties, we are talking about the social epidemiology, and so on. And when we talk about the social determinants of health, what do we understand by social determinants of health? So we say that epidemiology is about many specialties. We talked that epidemiology also looks at the social determinants of health. Any candidate who can tell us what do we understand by the social determinants of health?
Thank you. By social determinants of health, I understand that those conditions that people grow in, live in, and they influence their health status, like socioeconomic status and other things.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Any other candidate who can tell us what he or she understands by the social determinants of health? Any other candidate, please? Hello? Do you have any other contribution of what do we understand by social determinants of health? Or who can give you some of the examples of the social determinants of health? Please go on.
Thank you. I can say that one of the examples is like, for example, poor housing. Poor housing can thus influence the living condition of a person, and therefore it will to make that the healthy living of that person very worse.
Yes, that is one of the examples. Do we have any other example of a social determinant of health? And remember that we talked that when we are talking about social determinants of health, these are the kind of social characteristics of individuals or even communities that may have influence on the health of those individuals. So any other example?
Social determinants of health can include nutrition status, education, as well as hygiene, including water to drink. We can also include the safe housing and neighborhoods.
Thank you so much. Your network was kind of disturbed. We couldn't hear you quite well.
I was
Can you
saying
just repeat? Yeah.
social determinants of health can include education, safe housing, transportation, and physical activities as well.
Okay. And if you talk about education, for instance, how can education have influence on the health of individuals or even communities?
For example, the life and being of literate people is so different from that of illiterate because
Mm-hmm.
those illiterate people are able to understand how life is going on, can understand what is being taught so easily so that they can improve their health statuses compared to those whose level of education is at low.
Hmm. Thank you so much. Any other contribution about a social determinant of health that has not been mentioned so far? So we talked about housing, we talked about education. Any other? Any other example of a social determinant of health that may have influence on the health of individuals or even the communities at large?
Income.
Mm-hmm. And how does
Income.
income has implication on the health of individuals?
Some people might be poor foreign educations, maybe, and that can influence their health because they are unable to access the services provided because of the cost.
We don't hear you well.
I was saying some people
Mm-hmm.
might not be able to buy some medication, for example, or to access the services, health services because of for the cost.
Mm-hmm. So some community members may not afford health-related services because of their level of income.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. Actually, those are some of the examples of the social determinants of health. There are many, so you can go on and so many other social determinants of health. But indeed, I just wanted for you to realize how other kind of determinants might also be influencing the health of individuals, even though some of the people are not rating this. Now, we talked about epidemiology being everywhere. It's also part of the public health and the population health. And if we say that epidemiology is part of the public health and population health, what do you understand by that? Any idea, please? How is epidemiology part of the public health and population health? Why is epidemiology important for the public health?
Thank you. Maybe it's because epidemiology deals with those diseases that among groups of people, how to prevent them and control them.
Yeah, indeed. Remember that we say that epidemiology is about the kind of systematic studying and having complete data to inform the decision. So it's not only about having the knowledge about a disease or about a health-related issue, it's also about how we are going to use that kind of knowledge in terms of monitoring and controlling of those kind of diseases, particularly communicable and non-communicable diseases, but also how to prevent those diseases in the first place and how to improve the health of individuals. Do you understand? So we are not only limiting ourselves in terms of knowing the social determinants of health, but we are also looking very much more importantly in how to use that kind of knowledge in terms of informing the decisions that are being made in the health system. So we are using the knowledge in terms of monitoring, in terms of controlling the diseases, but also how to improve the general health. Are we together so far?
Yes.
Great. Now, when we talk about epidemiology, there are two main concepts that we often use that are being used in epidemiology, and these are incidence and prevalence. I think this is not the first time that you have heard about the incidence and prevalence in terms of epidemiology. And what is the difference between the two concepts? What is it when we talk about incidence in epidemiology or when we talk about prevalence?
Incidence is number of new cases we have and of a disease or people who are affected with a disease. By talking about prevalence is how many people have that disease or are affected by the disease.
So what is the difference between the two? Like, what is the keyword?
For me, incidence is new cases. Prevalence is the existing cases we have.
Thank you so much. Any addition? We are talking about the main concepts that are being used in epidemiology, because as we just learned, epidemiology is about the study not only of the diseases but also of other health conditions. Now we are trying to understand the difference between these two concepts, incidence and prevalence. Any addition?
Hello.
Yes.
According to me, the incidence refers to occurrence or existence cases in a certain period of time. For instance, the existence of new cases in 1 year, whereas the prevalence, it is total number of patients or people who have already affected by condition at that period.
Indeed, that is how it is. When we are talking about the incidence and the prevalence, we can just understand it from different sides, but let us look at the numerators. When we talk about the incidence, it's just the number of the new cases during a specific time period. So you are just identifying new cases during a specified time period. You are just giving yourself a specific time period in which you are going to observe the new cases of an event or a disease. And when we are talking about the prevalence, it's just the number of the existing cases at a point of time. If you just go out and have kind of a cross-sectional study, and it just identifies people who are having, for instance, HIV, at that particular moment. That is what we call the prevalence. But when we are having a cohort study, for instance, where we are just going to follow people and see who are going to become infected of HIV, that is what we call incidence. And the denominator will always be the population at risk for both the incidence and the prevalence. For the focus, when we talk about the incidence, we are only focusing on new or even newly diagnosed case for the time of onset. While for the prevalence, we are looking at the presence or even the absence within a specific time. And the incidence is mainly being used for the risk of, to understand the risk of getting the disease. This is the main measure for acute diseases. For instance, if there's something, a kind of disease that is occurring in a specific community, but it is also being used to measure some kind of, or even to monitor some kind of chronic conditions. And when we talk about prevalence, this is just the probability of the population to have the disease. We just want to understand the disease burden. How big is the disease? But we are not only focusing on the new cases, but mainly focusing on the existing cases. They might be existing cases, but also adding some kind of new cases. Do we understand the difference between the incidence and the prevalence so far?
Yes.
Great. Now, let's talk about some kind of the factors that might increase or even decrease the prevalence. According to you, what do you think might be the factors that might lead to the increase or even the decrease of a particular health condition or even a disease? So if you are talking about the prevalence, and you have defined it as the number of the existing cases at a point of time, what might be the factors related to the increase of the prevalence or even the decrease of the prevalence?
For me, I think for the prevalence, because the existing cases, to deal with it, it's all about treatment, and because there are people who are already have that factor or that disease, so you have to tackle on that disease treatment of those people, so you can decrease the number who have that factor.
So the treatment can also lead to the decrease of a certain health condition or the prevalence of that disease among the community. What other factors might lead to the decrease of the prevalence apart from the treatment?
Thank you.
Other factors can
Like
be the development
another
presence of control measures.
One person, please.
Presence of
Yes, what I think is like early detection of the cases, like before being spread everywhere.
How does early detection lead to the decrease of the disease? How would you explain that?
Like we are like every month they do the screening, and then people should always go to check, and then they see if there is some underlying condition in their bodies.
So do you also relate it to the treatment, to the early treatment?
Yeah, some kind
Early
of.
detection and then early treatment? How do you
Yes, it
explain
goes
that?
hand in hand. Yeah, they detect and treat. It's like kind of similar.
There's some background noise. We can't hear you well.
I was saying, we detect the case and we provide the treatment. So they go hand in hand.
Okay. Thank you. Any other factor that may lead to the decrease of a disease?
Thank you. Another factor that can affect the incidence case is the transmission way of the disease.
What do you mean by the transmission rate and how it can be related to the decrease of the disease, of the prevalence?
Thank you. Other factor can development of
No. Can I just ask others to mute? Thank you. So you were just talking about the transmission ways and how this can be related to the decrease of the prevalence. How would you explain that?
I can explain this by using example like disease that are transmitted through blood contact compared to the one transmitted to the blood contact. It's clear that the incidence will increase in the case where the disease transmitted by body contact compared to the one where disease is transmitted by, for example, blood contact.
Mm-hmm. Is that clear to everyone? Can we say that the diseases that are being transmitted by blood are less likely to be transmitted or even more likely to be transmitted? So according to you, the diseases that are being transmitted by blood can lead to the increase of the prevalence, right? Is that what you are trying to explain?
Yes.
Who does agree with what your colleague is mentioning? Give us an example. Give us an example that is being transmitted by blood and how this is being related to the high prevalence. Give us an example, please, of a particular disease that you have in mind. Hello? Who was giving that answer? Hello?
I was explaining how the transmission way of a given disease can affect the new cases, the incidence cases, by using example. I can explain this by, for example, using specific diseases like HIV that is transmitted through blood contact, compared, for example, with COVID-19. The new cases being recorded are so different based on their way of transmission. That's how I was trying to explain.
There's background noise. I didn't hear you well. I'm not sure that others have been able to listen. Just repeat for once again.
The examples I was giving incidents recorded in COVID-19 cases compared to the HIV cases. They are so different because their transmission way are also so different.
In which ways? Like if you're talking about the incidence or even the prevalence of COVID-19 and HIV, what do you mean? And how are these different based on the mode of transmission?
The incidence cases of COVID-19 are so high because their COVID is easily transmitted from one people to another through because COVID is like airborne disease, but HIV cases are in number because it's not easily transmitted compared to the COVID because HIV is a blood contact transmitted.
But both diseases are being transmitted from one person to the other, right? Isn't it? I think we can still debate in terms of how modes of transmission of particular disease can lead to the increase or even the decrease. It is totally understandable and possible. But when you are talking about a disease like COVID and HIV, they are both transmitted from one person to the other. So the kind of the mode
We
of
are not seeing the slide.
Yeah, I'm just reflecting on what we were saying. It's not. I'm not using the slide for now. But what I just wanted to highlight is that the mode of transmission indeed can explain the increase or even the decrease of the prevalence of a particular disease. But when we are talking about the case of COVID and HIV, I think we can agree or even disagree more. And this debate we can just leave it for now. Now, when we talk about the factors influencing the prevalence, as you have just mentioned, there are some factors that may lead to the increase, mainly the longer duration of the disease, like for instance, the HIV is not a curable disease, and therefore, if it is not a curable disease, people may have it for longer duration, and they may live for long. But we can also talk about the life prolongation without cure. We can talk about the increase in terms of the incidence. So if there is kind of epidemic, this might also explain the increased prevalence. We might also look at the migration of the people who are susceptible to that particular disease. But we might also look in terms of the improved diagnosis. So if there is improved diagnosis, It may also lead to the improved cure, and which is also going to, I mean, if there's improved diagnosis, while there was no way of diagnosing that particular disease, it might explain the reason why the prevalence is high. It doesn't mean that the prevalence was not being high in previous days, but it is mainly being explained by improved diagnosis. So if there is a ways of diagnosis a particular disease, that might also explain the reason why the prevalence is high compared to the previous time, for instance. And when we talk about the decrease, some kind of the factors that might lead to the prevalence, to the decrease of the prevalence, one might also say about the shorter duration of the disease. For instance, if there is a strong disease which is leading to the high mortality or even high morbidity and mortality, the death of the people might also explain the reason why the prevalence is decreasing. We might also relate it to the decrease in terms of the incidence, in terms of migration, but also in terms of the improved cure rate. And I think one of you mentioned about the diagnosis and treatment. Indeed, when there is the treatment, early treatment, this is going to lead to the decrease in terms of the prevalence. Now, we just talked about the epidemiology. We just talked about the main concepts in terms of epidemiology that are being used in epidemiology, namely the incidence and the prevalence, and what might explain the decrease and increase in terms of the prevalence of particular disease. Now we are going to be focusing about what is social epidemiology. So the social epidemiology is that kind of the branch of epidemiology that is mainly looking at the social distribution and the social determinants of states of health. And when we are starting our lessons, we also listed some kind of the social determinants that might influence the health. Indeed, we also need to understand the relationship between the social structure and health when we talk about the social epidemiology. And what do we mean by relationship and what is the social structure? When we talk about the relationship, here we are talking about other important concepts. So we are talking about the exposure, but we are also talking about the outcome. So there cannot be relationship without someone being exposed to something, and there cannot be outcome without exposure. This is what we say about the relationship. But in terms of epidemiology, what do we mean by exposure and what do we mean by outcome? And before we go further, any candidate who can just tell us what he or she thinks about the exposure and the outcome in terms of epidemiology.
Exposure is like the way you are exposed to something. I was saying exposure is the way people are exposed to certain things which can cause disease. So the outcome is what is seen after being exposed. For example, if you're exposed to smoking, you are likely to get lung cancer in the future. So outcome will be lung cancer, and exposure is the time you've been exposed to smoking.
So being exposed to the smoking may lead to cancer, lung cancer as an outcome.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any other contribution? What do we understand by exposure and outcome in terms of in the field of epidemiology or even the social epidemiology? Any other contribution, please? Any other contribution? What do we understand by exposure and by outcome? Your colleague was just mentioning, giving an example of being exposed to smoking and lung cancer. Do we have any other contribution?
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Outcome, by outcome, I understand that it may be that disease that is being studied on, and exposure, it's any factors that is leading to that outcome.
And for you, what is outcome? What do you understand by outcome?
By outcome, I understand the results
Mm-hmm.
that was caused by all those factors which.
And help us understand by giving an example, for instance. Do you have like a specific example?
Okay, like an example, let's say bad weather and common cold, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So when a person is exposed to bad weather, he is likely to develop common cold.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Indeed, when we are talking about exposure and the outcome, we are talking about something that is happening in the first instance, but also the kind of the result that is being associated with that exposure. In epidemiology, when we talk about outcome variable, we also call it a dependent variable, or even the response variable, which means that there cannot be a response or something cannot happen without exposure being taken in place. And when we talk about the exposure variable, we indeed talk about those variables or even those factors that are leading to the explaining or the explanation of the outcome variable. And you have just provided some of the examples, like being exposed to the smoking and the lung cancer at the long run, but also being exposed to the bad weather or cold weather and how it is being also related to the cold or even flu and so on. So indeed, there cannot be an outcome in terms of epidemiology. You cannot say there is an outcome without talking about the exposure. And for this particular reason, the exposure is being called independent variable or even the explanatory variable. So this is something that can just stand by its own, but also lead to the kind of response variable. So there is two different variables. One is independent variable. It means that really it is happening by its own, but it is leading to the kind of the outcome that we are observing. And when we talk about the outcome variable, this is dependent of the independent variable that has taken in place. So these are also other two concepts that are very key in terms of epidemiology, in terms of the social epidemiology, when we are talking about the relationship. And for instance, when we talk about malaria, in terms of exposure, in terms of outcome, how do people get malaria, for instance? How do people get malaria? What kind of exposure that is taking place for malaria to happen, for people to have, to fall sick of malaria? Any candidate? In reference to the exposure and outcome variables, how do people get malaria, or even why?
I think about the exposure, the people living near the swamps, the people living in the forestry or tropical areas, it can be an exposure to different factors that can attract those female anopheles that can cause a malaria. And the outcome is an increase in malaria.
So the environmental factors might lead to people falling or getting sick of malaria.
Yes.
Other reasons, apart from the environmental factors, what other factors might expose people to getting malaria? Just think about it for a while I'm plugging my computer.
kugira ngo ndeke kwivugira malariya.
Hello, class. Do you hear me now?
Yes, we are hearing you.
Sorry for the disturbance. I was just trying to connect my computer.
No matter.
Yeah, I was just talking about how do people get malaria in terms of the exposure and the outcome. The outcome being malaria, disease. What else can we say in terms of the exposure? Your colleague just mentioned about the environmental factors. What other factors might expose people to getting malaria? Any candidate?
People also, I'm saying, people also are ignorant, exposed to malaria, because they don't practice the measures of controlling malaria.
We don't hear you well.
I'm saying the ignorant people are also exposed to malaria because they do not put into practice the measures of controlling malaria.
So the lack of knowledge in terms of the prevention of malaria can also get people being exposed to malaria. And here that is the most important part of the things, because indeed malaria is being exposed or is being transmitted by a mosquito, right? A female mosquito, Anopheles. But why do some people get malaria and why do others not get malaria? And here we might explain it by the social determinants of health. And you just mentioned about ignorance of people or the lack of the knowledge. Your colleague also mentioned about the environmental factors. What other factors might explain this, the transmission of malaria?
And other factors, I think lifestyle factors can also influence the spread of malaria.
What do you mean by lifestyle factors?
Okay, like living in a place where there is high like canopers or
Living in a
like
place?
high those mosquitoes will be living in a place where there is high mosquitoes and anopheles where those parasites can grow, or visiting a place where there is high spread of malaria.
So in a place where there is high prevalence or even high incidence of malaria, can also expose people to getting malaria. But when we are talking about the social epidemiology, tell me, what factors can you just think that may lead to or may explain the transmission of malaria? Not only scientific ways of explaining the transmission of malaria, but what kind of other social determinants, factors that might explain the transmission of malaria? So we just talked about indeed the environmental factors. We just mentioned about the lack of knowledge. We just mentioned about the high prevalence or incidence of malaria in a particular place. But what other factors you may think? I can just give you a hint, like employment, for instance. the risky employment. What kind of risky employment can you think of when we talk about malaria transmission? Can you just think of any type of job that might expose people to malaria? No job? Class, are we together? What kind of job position, for instance, that can put someone at risk of getting malaria?
Especially those guys who are working in the swamps or like in a rice plantation.
Indeed, people are working in rice plantation, the night guards, the fishermen, and so on. So you can see that there are other factors that can explain the transmission of a disease, not only by being exposed. Everyone can be exposed to a mosquito, but not everyone will be exposed to the same extent to the mosquito bites. So there are people who are more likely to be exposed to malaria compared to others. Here we were just talking about background noise. Please mute yourself. Thank you so much. So we were just talking about the kind of risk employment. But we can also talk about how people think about a particular disease. For instance, we talked about the lack of knowledge, but we also know that there are those people who have the knowledge of the importance of, for instance, using the net, but they are not using it. That might also explain the transmission of malaria, the exposure to malaria. Do you understand? So it's not only about the lack of knowledge, but also having the knowledge, but also the kind of the behaviors, the kind of the conception or even the misconceptions of the individuals of the communities about the malaria preventive measures can also expose them to malaria. Are we together so far? Hello? Are we still together?
Yes, we're still together.
Okay. So here I just wanted to explain that malaria transmission is not only about the mosquitoes and the transmission of malaria, but we also need to have that kind of broad understanding of the transmission of the disease from one person to the other or from one community to the other. There might be some similarities, there might be some differences depending on the various social determinants of health that we just mentioned. We are still in terms of the relationship, and here we also want to understand the web of causation. Indeed, there is the microbes, as one of you mentioned. There might be some kind of phenotypes. There might be some kind of behaviors, as I just mentioned. Someone having the knowledge about the use of bed nets, but they don't use it because of the misconceptions they have about the nets. It might be the environment, as your colleague just mentioned, people are living near the swamps and so on. It might be the workplace, as we just mentioned. We were talking about the night guards, we were talking about the fishermen, We also talked about other kind of, indeed, jobs that might expose people to the kind of the disease. But there might also be some kind of other unknown factors that might be related to the particular disease. So there are really a broad range when we talk about the relationship, when we talk about the causation of the disease and the outcome.
Actually, I'm not seeing your slide.
You're not seeing the slide?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. What happened? Do you see them now?
Not yet.
Do you see the slides now?
Not yet. Not yet. I don't know if the others are seeing it, but me, I'm not seeing it.
Do you see the slides now?
Yes, thank you.
Great. So I was just trying to explain the web of causation of a disease, where we talked about the phenotypes, where we talked about the behaviors of the people, we talked about the environmental factors, we talked about the workplace factors, but there might also be some other kind of unknown factors that might be related to the transmission of a particular disease. And when we talk about the relationship, there is what they call sufficient component cause model, where we have different scenarios. So one might be that you may be exposed to the A, B, C, D, E in kind of linear sequence, but you may also have some kind of symptom exposures in the second model, and you may also have the other kind of exposures. So it's not always a linear sequence in terms of exposure and outcome. You might have some kind of exposure factors in one of the model. You might also have other kind of explanatory factors in the second model and in the third, and so on. And for this sufficient component cause model, I would recommend you to go and read it in this reference that is being provided below, because we don't have enough time to go through it now. Now, when we talk about the sufficient cause for TB, indeed, we just mentioned about it for malaria and some kind of factors that might be related to that. And when we talk about TB, for instance, you might be exposed to TB because you are having AIDS and the immunity is poor. Because of the poor nutrition, you might also get exposed to the TB. But there can also be another sufficient cause model that can explain the TB, which is tuberculosis. I think you know. It might be absence of the vaccine. People who are not being vaccinated can get the disease. It might be the environmental factors, living in a place where there are so many people, a crowded people. It might be related to the poor ventilation. So one person can be exposed to TB because of having AIDS, because of having poor nutrition, for instance. But another person can be exposed to TB because of the absence of the vaccine, because of the place where he's living or he's working, or because of the poor ventilation. So having a disease might not always be explained in the same way for different people. So someone might have exposed to TB, not because they are having HIV and AIDS, not because they are having poor nutrition, but because, for instance, they have not been vaccinated. I think you can just understand what we call by the sufficient cause for TB to happen. So there might be different scenarios to explain the outcome of the disease, but all the time there should be the exposure to one of the factors, but the factors are not the same to explain the disease in different people. Is this clear? So two people may have the TB, may have exposure to TB, but the exposure might be different for the same outcome. Do you understand, class? Do you understand when we talk about the sufficient cause component model of the disease?
I didn't get it.
Who did get it and try to understand, to explain to the colleagues? Who did get it? Who did get something, for instance?
Hello.
Yes.
According to that sufficient cause for outcome, you said that the exposure is different, but the outcome is the same. By referring on that example of TB, we have seen that someone can get TB due to having of AIDS, exposure to TB, or poor nutrition. And also in the next column, someone can get TB when they do not get vaccinated for ventilation or exposure to TB. By simply, in simple words, this is sufficient cause of outcome relationship. The exposure are different, but outcome are the same.
Thank you. Any other contribution about the sufficient component cause model? Using the example of the TB? Any other contribution? Any other contribution when we talk about the sufficient cause model? Indeed, when we talk about something that is sufficient, even by name, so if, for instance, you are having AIDS, yeah, if you are being exposed to TB, for instance, and you are having AIDS, HIV and AIDS, and you are having poor nutrition, automatically it's having TB may be quicker for the people who are having HIV and AIDS compared to those who are not having HIV and AIDS having poor nutrition. So there is a sufficient cause. You are being exposed to TB, but you are also having HIV and AIDS, and you are having poor nutrition. So those are kind of the sufficient causes for the TB to happen. However, someone might be exposed to TB without having HIV and AIDS, without having poor nutrition, and don't get TB. Is that true or false? True or false, dear class?
True.
Do the people who are being exposed to TB always get TB?
False.
So what are the factors explaining that people who are getting exposed to TB get the TB as a disease? And those factors are the ones that we call the sufficient causes for a disease to happen. Please go on. Is it clear now? So there should be a sufficient, what we call a sufficient cause for an outcome to happen. So not all the exposures will lead to the outcome, but there should be some kind of the sufficient causes for exposure to cause or to lead to an outcome. Is that clear?
Yes.
Thank you.
No. For me, I'm not getting it well.
Who did get something and try to explain to your colleagues?
This means that people who are always exposed to TB don't always get TB, but the sufficient cause will always lead to TB as an outcome.
The sufficient cause, please repeat your contribution.
You have said that people who are exposed to TB do not always get TB, but the sufficient cause are enough to cause TB as an outcome.
The sufficient cause are?
The sufficient cause are enough to cause TB as an outcome.
And for you, what is the sufficient cause, for instance?
For me, the sufficient cause is the exposure who will always lead to the TB as an outcome.
Yeah, if for instance we take an example of the first pie, where we are talking about exposure to TB, AIDS, and poor nutrition. So a person with HIV and AIDS, and in the stage of AIDS, it's not only about HIV, it's the person who is at the stage of having the symptoms, who also has poor nutrition. If we get exposed to TB, automatically it will lead to the disease. Do you understand? The person who has having AIDS, not only HIV, but who is at the stage of having the disease or having the symptoms, and he's exposed to the kind of the poor nutrition. He doesn't have enough food or even the kind of the balanced diet. If that person is going to get in touch with the TB, automatically it will lead to the having or to the contracting the disease. So those are the sufficient causes, for instance, for someone to get TB. You're having AIDS, but you're also having poor nutrition. But a person who is, for instance, having HIV and AIDS, or who is having HIV only, and he's having good nutrition, if he's going to be exposed to the TB, he might or he may not always get the disease. So for us, what we are calling a sufficient cause is really something that can lead to the outcome. If you're talking about exposure and outcome, we are really looking at the exposure that might explain the outcome to happen. But when you are talking about exposures, there might be some different exposures for different people. And that is why the second part is also talking about the absence of the vaccine, BCG. So if a person did not get a BCG vaccination at birth, and he or she is living under the conditions of crowding, where there are so many people who are sleeping and living in the same house, for instance, if there is a poor ventilation in that particular house, and if one of the people living in that house has active TB, then he's exposing others as well. Particularly, he's exposing the one who did not get the vaccine. So here we are talking about the relationship. We are trying to understand what kind of the sufficient causes that might explain why people are being exposed, but also having the outcome as a disease, and why other people might be exposed but not presenting the disease. And the pathway can just be different from one person to the other depending on the exposure factors. I hope this is clear for now. And let's move to the next slide because we are just still having a lot to learn. And when we talk about the relationship, a relationship between factors may be coincidence, it might be a bias, it might be confounding, but it might also be causal. So these are the kind of the relationship that we are talking about in terms of epidemiology. When we are talking about exposure and the outcome. So it might be that the relationship is just a coincidence. It might be that the relationship is just a bias, that there is no relationship, it's just a bias. But it might also be that the relationship is just confounding. And finally, it might be that the relationship is causal. I think when we talk about coincidence and bias, we just understand what we mean. But what do we mean when we are talking about the confounding relationship? What do you understand by the confounding relationship in terms of exposure and outcome? Any contribution? Any contribution about the confounding relationship of the exposure and the outcome? Any contribution, dear team? So when you talk about coincidence, it's just happening by chance. When you're talking about bias, it's just that there are so many factors or types of bias, but it's just a false correlation. There is no relationship between the two. But what do we mean by confounding relationship? Who can just try? Can try to tell us what is a confounding relationship means. Anyone who can just try to tell us the confounding relationship? Dear team, I'm just waiting for someone who can try. So we have said that there is a relationship between the exposure and the outcome. And we just mentioned that the relationship might just be a coincidence. So it's not really something that is related, but it is happening by coincidence. We also mentioned that we can just call it a bias or even false correlation. There is no relationship. But here I'm just emphasizing on the confounding relationship. What does it mean? What does it mean, Tim?
Like surprising. Maybe surprising. You don't know the cause, you don't know, it's confusing you.
Is that a confounding or a coincidence?